Hi and welcome to my channel. In today's video I'm going to talk about consumer-driven contract testing, and I'm going to also demonstrate it with an example for Spring Boot microservices. If you're new to this channel, my name is Helmut Ziegel. I'm a senior Java full-stack engineer. I work as an independent contractor and I create software engineering related content. Now let's get started with contract testing.
First of all, what is a contract? A contract is a list of agreement between a service that acts as a consumer and a service that acts as a provider. Now, let's imagine the following situation. We have two services, a book producer and a book consumer. The book producer has two REST endpoints, one that returns all the books and the other one that returns a book by ID. The book consumer depends on the book producer, which means that the book producer serves the book consumer with its data through the defined REST endpoints. Between the book consumer and the book producer, there is a contract that defines how can the book consumer consume the data from the book producer. Now, what happens when the book producer introduces a change? Let's say the method that returns all the books instead of /API/book will be changed to /API/books. With this action, the book producer broke the contract, and that will be visible only after the new version of the book producer will be deployed. In case of monolithic architecture, we don't have this problem simply because the book producer and the consumer are in the same project, probably in different modules, but still the same project, and the book consumer invokes directly the methods of the book producer. In that case, if any changes appear in the book producer, we get instant feedback from the compiler. Because we don't get instant feedback from the compiler in case of microservices, we need contract tests. Tests that verify that a service is compliant with the contract are known as contract tests. The next question is, who owns the contract? As earlier mentioned, the best way to validate that a consumer and a provider can communicate correctly is to define a contract between them. But we haven't mentioned who has ownership of this contract, the consumer team or the provider team. If the ownership of the contract lies with the team that's developing the provider, this implies that they not only know the business behavior of their own service, but also the requirement of all consumers their service supports. This kind of contract is called provider contract because the contract belongs to the provider and consumers are merely viewers of it. The next possibility is to change the ownership of the contract by making the developers of the consumer service define what they need and send that contract to the provider team to implement. Such a contract is called a consumer contract because it belongs to the consumer. The third possibility is the consumer-driven contract. A consumer-driven contract represents an aggregation of all the contracts a provider has with all of its consumers. Consumer-driven contracts establish that a service provider is developed from its consumer's perspective. Each consumer communicates to its provider the specific requirements for meeting that consumer's use case. These requirements then create an obligation on the provider side to meet all the expectations of all the consumers. The flow of a consumer-driven contract testing is that first the consumer defines the contract, then sends to the producer, and then the producer validates it. Validating the contract means that the producer implements the expectations of the consumer. Now, let's look at a tool you can use to write contract tests. Pact is a family of test frameworks that provide support for consumer-driven contract testing. It has official implementation for Ruby, JVM languages, .NET, JavaScript, Go, Python, Objective-C, PHP, and Swift languages. The Pact framework lets you write contracts on the consumer side by providing a mock HTTP server and a Fluent API to define the HTTP requests made from the consumer to service provider and the HTTP responses expected in return. Now let's switch to the IDE and see some examples. So we have here two Spring Boot projects. One of them is the book producer, the other one is the book consumer. They are pretty simple Spring Boot projects. The book producer has a controller with three endpoints, one that returns all the books, the other one that returns a book by ID, and we also have the possibility to search by title. We have a really simple data model for a book. A book has an ID, title, author, and created. The book controller injects the book service. The book service is a simple service that has three hard-coded books, and the method that returns all the books, one that returns a book by ID, and the third one for searching by title. The book producer runs on port 8081, and this is the path for getting all the books. We also have the possibility to get a book by ID and to search by title. In this case, we searched by keyword Java and we found the book Effective Java. Now let's look at the book consumer. The book consumer is pretty similar to the book producer. So we have a controller, but in this case we only have two endpoints, one that returns all the book and one that returns a book by ID. The data model is also slightly different. We here only have ID, title, and author. We don't have the created. And the book controller injects the book service. And in this case, we don't have the hard-coded books. We simply invoke the book producer for getting all the books or getting a book by ID. The book consumer runs on port 8082 and the path is also slightly different. This is the path for getting all the books. We have the possibility to get a book by ID, but in this case, we don't have the possibility to get a book by title. Now that we have seen the architecture of the book consumer and the book producer, let's look at the contract tests. First of all, on the consumer side. To write contract tests using Pact on the consumer side, we have to add the following dependency, and after that, we can write our contract tests. We have here a definition of a contract on the consumer side, which actually means just that when we invoke the following path as a get method, we expect a status of 200, we expect a header content type application JSON, and the following data. Now, here is the test case for this specified contract. We have a simple Spring Boot test. We inject the book controller. And what happens behind the scenes with this contract definition is that Pact creates a mock book producer server, which has only one endpoint with the given specifications. And when here we invoke the book controller, behind the scenes, the mock server will be invoked. And what we test here is simply just that we test the size of the received list, and we also test if each field of the received list is not null. Now, here we have another contract definition, and this definition consists of two parts. We see that PEG gives us the possibility to chain multiple definitions in one contract. And what we test here is simply the get by ID. And we have a definition for a case when the book exists, and the other one when the book does not exist. And in that case, we expect a status of 400. And here we have the test, and we simply first invoke the get by ID with the ID of 1, which will give us back the book. And the other one when we invoke with an ID of 404, and we expect a no such element exception. Now let's run the tests and see the results of it. The tests ran successfully, which means that on the consumer side, we implemented correctly our business logic to our expectation of the book producer. After running the tests, Pact generates a JSON file that contains all our test cases and our expectations to the book producer, and the file is under the target Pacts folder. Now let's look at the contract test on the producer side. First of all, we have to add the following dependency, and after that, all we have to do is the following. We have to specify the folder where the contracts are, and after that, we have to set the target of the pact verification context, and we just have to verify the interactions. So what does that mean exactly? So we have a generated JSON file on the consumer side, which is the test cases and our expectations, and we have to send that to the producer. In this case, we just have to copy paste this file in this folder, and after that, we have to run this test class on the producer side. Now we see that all the tests passed. Now let's try out some pretty simple things. First of all, change the path of the by title to search by title and run the tests on the producer side again. We see that all the tests passed, and that happens simply because the book consumer doesn't depend on the get by title. Now let's change the path of the by ID to the following by ID and run the tests again. So in this case, we have a failed test, which simply just give us instant feedback that we have a consumer that depends on this change.
These were just some simple examples. Of course, Pact is much more powerful. If you want to know a bit more about contract testing, then I highly recommend you the book Testing Java Microservices, which has an entire chapter about contract testing, and also checking out the official page of the Pact. The code example I showed you in the video is on my GitHub page. I highly recommend you to check out to see the whole source code. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you learned something. I wish you a really great day.